Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Top 10 Rock Albums from the last 10 years. So this is going to span from 2013 to 2023, the current year that we are in. Obviously, we're not all the way through here, so depending on when you watch it, there may be some other great albums that have dropped in the meantime, but we are filming this in June, so at least up until June of 2023, that is the time frame we are taking into account here. Only albums of new original material. I'm not looking at live albums, compilations, or archival releases. And the bottom line is there's just so many great albums that rock bands have put out in the last decade. And I thought doing a countdown of those albums and touching on some of the newer things. We're always going back doing the classics and stuff like that. But there's some good classic sounding albums and some real return to form albums from our favorite bands. And so we're going to cover that here as part of the top 10 rock albums from the last 10 years. So stick around for that. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this with the top 10 rock albums from the last 10 years. Now, before we get started, I've got an honorable mention, and it really just comes down to the fact that I got my 10, but I actually got 11, and I just couldn't cut one of them. So this one here is becoming the honorable mention. Billy Idol, Kings and Queens of the Underground from 2014. An absolutely stupendous album from him. It was his 8th studio album and first one in 9 years when it came out since Devil's Playground that had come out in 2005. This one here is actually his last full-length album to date, so it's been 9 years already since this one, although he has put out 2 EPs with studio tracks and stuff on it. They're very good also, but he chose not to gather them together as a full-length album. This album here features longtime guitarist Steve Stevens on it, and in my opinion was just a great return to form album. You know, after Devil's Playground, that was much more into the pop punk sound of the day and everything like that, and I can understand why Billy was going into that, being that he sort of helped generate that sound and style. This one here is so much more classic sounding, falling somewhere along the Whiplash Smile album of 1986, which is a personal favorite of mine. Lots of great standout tracks on this thing: Bitter Pill, Save Me Now, and personal favorite Postcards from the Past. But we're going to go ahead now and kick off with the top 10 rock albums from the last 10 years, and coming in at number 10, Alice Cooper, Paranormal from 2017. This one here, 20th solo album from him, but 27th overall if we take into account the Alice Cooper Band albums as well. Now what's interesting is this actually features 3 tracks of the original Alice Cooper Band on it. 1 on the main album itself, 2 on the bonus disc that comes along with it, and we've got Michael Bruce on guitar, Dennis Dunaway on bass, and Neil Smith on drums, all from the original band, minus Glenn Buxton, of course, who passed away unfortunately in 1997. There's a lot of cool other people on here. We got Roger Glover from Deep Purple, Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top on this, Larry Mullen Jr. from U2 is on here even. But the album is a very sort of old school sound to it. It was a welcome return after the 2 previous albums that went into that much more modern territory that he was trying to do. Was not a fan really of that sort of stuff. Standout tracks on this one: Paranormal, Dead Flies, Paranoid Personality, and Dynamite Road. All right, coming in at number 9, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Hypnotic Eye, 2014, 13th and final studio album, unfortunately, as Tom passed away in 2017. That was, of course, following his 40th anniversary tour, and to think that he only had 13 sort of official studio albums. Since then, they've put out some other archival stuff, but only doing 13 during his time over those 40 years. This one here was also his only album to top the Billboard 200 album chart, which is kind of a nice way to go out, where your last album is actually your highest charting one in a 40-year career. What was interesting is it actually sold 131,000 copies in the US alone to enter at #1, where, you know, album sales these days is usually not very high. That was a pretty big number to achieve that. And this one here is perfect, classic sounding album from the band after their previous album was a blues-based album, Mojo, from 2010. This one here really came back, providing those melodic rock tracks and everything that we love about Tom Petty. Got that soulful sort of swagger that he does from the, you know, his southern vocals and everything on this. I love the songs American Dream, Plan B. Fault Lines is my favorite track off the album, and Forgotten Man is a great little hidden gem on there. Okay, coming in at #8, Pearl Jam, Lightning Bolt, from 2013, going all the way back, the full decade that we can go for this guy. 10th studio album, also debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200 album chart. Its first week sales was 166,000 copies. The album returns the band to a more hard rock sound, longer extended songs, more than on the previous album Backspacer from 2009. Lots and lots of classic sounding tracks on this. Getaway, which I think has a sort of feel to it like State of Love and Trust, which happens to be my favorite song from Pearl Jam. So getting something else that was like that, of course, just kicked this album off as something really good for me. Mind Your Manners, first single from it. Sirens is so beautiful, and Infallible is another great track off here. This one here I think is on par with Vitology in 1994 and No Code from 1996. That's kind of where I've always placed this album in my mind, at least. Coming in at #7, Def Leppard, self-titled release from 2015, 12th studio album from the band. Finally, a true return to form album from them, at least as close as we're ever going to get. Now, of course, that's all dependent upon what you consider the band's true form to be. A lot of people want them to return to their more new wave of British heavy metal sound of the first two albums. I like the stuff that came after with Pyromania, Hysteria, Adrenalize, and so forth. For me, it is a return to that. So it's as close, I think, as we're ever going to get to something like Hysteria or Adrenalize. It's kind of right in there. The song Dangerous on here is such a classic. I think it easily could have fit on either of those two albums, while the song Man Enough on here has some, you know, verging into some other territory, but it's very close to Pour Some Sugar on Me. It's got that sort of vibe and everything with it. And then there's a song We Belong, which has all 5 of the band members singing, and that's a first for the band. Just one of their best albums in their whole catalog, in my opinion. Coming in at #6, Bryan Adams, Get Up from 2015, his 13th studio album. Produced by ELO frontman Jeff Lynne, who's known for working with Tom Petty, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Roy Orbison, and so many others. But understanding that and understanding that he comes from ELO, this is a very different sounding Bryan Adams album. So this is not some return to form sort of thing, as I've talked about on some of these other ones. This one here had him verging off in other territory. And it was a real shock to me, but in repeated listens, it kept growing and growing and growing. It's actually one of my favorite albums from him now. And I absolutely love the opening track, You Belong to Me, on here. But You Go Down Rockin' and a number of the other songs that are on this thing have found a way to fit in nicely to his catalog, even though, as I said, this is a very different sounding Bryan Adams album than his usual stuff. Okay, coming in at #5, Bon Jovi, This House Is Not For Sale, 2016 release, 14th studio album. First not to feature original guitarist Richie Sambora. In his place is guitarist Phil X from Triumph, who's actually now a member of the band, along with bassist Hugh McDonald, who had been with the band for some time touring and as a studio session musician, but is now officially a band member. So for me, this album really signaled a new chapter for the band. I think it's their strongest album in about 2 decades and has some amazing tracks on it. I love the title track, This House Is Not For Sale, New Year's Day, and God Bless This Mess. And what I thought was cool is that the band actually made a video for every song on here, and it was nice to see an established band pushing a newer album so hard the way they did back in the day. Coming in at number 4, AC/DC Power Up from 2020. Man, this album here saved us that year during the pandemic, the lockdown. Oh, what a year. But when that album was announced, I think that was somewhere around June or something like that. I mean, it was just such a great album to come out rocking like that. It's their 16th studio album internationally, second album without Malcolm Young, founding member. However, it is built around leftover riffs that Malcolm had written with Angus. I do see this very much as a sequel to Rock or Bust, which I happen to like. I know a lot of you don't, but I do think it has a lot more memorable songs than Rock or Bust. Rock or Bust was kind of one that I would listen to and I knew it immediately, whereas this one had much more depth to it, so I could really digest it a lot more. More peaks and valleys on this one here. Lead single off this, Shot in the Dark, I think is a very classic sounding song. I hope they keep it in the repertoire for years to come. But there was a lot of other great tracks on here. One of my favorites being Through the Mists of Time, Kick You When You're Down, and the last track on the album, Code Red. Okay, coming in at number 3, Deep Purple, Now What, from 2013, 19th studio album from the band. First new album in 8 years when it was released, following Rapture of the Deep in 2008. It's produced by Bob Ezrin, who's worked with Kiss and Pink Floyd, and it featured the band in a more progressive mood than their maybe some of their previous albums and stuff, but it also had the band, firmly rooted in their hard rock roots. So it was a nice sort of melding of both classic sound, but also something a little more modern and new, exploring and pushing boundaries and things like that. It happens to be my favorite of the Steve Morris era too. Lots of great standout tracks. The single Hell to Pay, which I didn't actually initially like when I first heard it, has now become one of my favorite songs on this album. I don't know why that is. Sometimes you're not in the mood for something when you first hear it, but I love that song now. Bodyline, Above and Beyond is beautiful. Uncommon Man, that one was even still in their set list when I saw them right before the pandemic, so they're keeping this stuff in there, showing you the quality of what this album is. All right, coming in at number 2, Styx, Crash of the Crown from 2021, 17th studio album, first in 4 years when it was released, follow-up to The Mission from 2017. Well, this one here is not a concept album. The Mission was a concept album. This one here did have an idea behind it where they wanted to take as many different parts of songs, squeeze them all together, mix it up, and just see how many they could, combine into one thing. So there's a lot of changing things that happen on this album in the middle of tracks, and I think it is just really interesting. You take all those sort of changes, it creates a very complex thing that goes on, but for some reason it just works so well here. It's one of the most interesting albums released that year, but again in the last decade, and in the Styx catalog. I love the songs The Fight of Our Lives, Reveries, Save Us From Ourselves, probably my personal favorite off the album, and Sound the Alarm. Okay, and the number 1 album from the last 10 years, in my opinion, probably no surprise if you know who I am, and one of my favorite bands, Pink Floyd, Endless River from 2014. Can't believe this album is already 9 years old. 15th studio album and final album to date. And the only reason I say that is because we know they had just released a single in the last year or so. Maybe it'll turn into more, you never know, but at least right now this is their final album. At least that's what they said at the time. Recorded and compiled using outtakes from the previous album, Division Bell, back in 1994. They decided to complete the project that they had started 20 years earlier, where Division Bell was actually supposed to be a double album. The album that we got, plus the second disc of what they had called instrumental ambient music. And so they ultimately built an album around that idea using all the unused material. And since Richard Wright had recorded his keyboard parts for this back in 1994, it became a nice tribute to him and legacy to the band since Richard Wright had passed away. But I think that the album itself also able to stand on its own 2 legs, despite the album only having one song with vocals on it, Lost for Words, and the rest of it being instrumental where it's broken into 4 suites. The album itself has a nice footing on it, like I said, standing on its own 2 legs, and is one of the later era's best albums in my opinion. And that's why, at least for this, it is the #1 album from the last 10 years for me. All right, everyone, there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm sure your #1 would be different than mine, and probably different albums included and whatnot. So let me know what your #1 album from the last 10 years is. And everyone have a great day. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.